June 5th, 1945. Commander Joe Kircher races through flooded compartments as 104 feet of his ship's bow tears away and floats into the Pacific. Water explodes through every crack. His crew has minutes before the bulkhead collapses and the ship goes down. But Kircher isn't panicking. He's already planned for this exact nightmare scenario. His damage control teams trained for months on impossible situations. Now they'll prove that proper preparation can defeat even typhoons that rip warships apart. This is the true story of how one officer's obsession with training saved 1,100 lives, turned a sinking wreck into a functional warship, and sailed 900 miles with no bow. The Navy called it impossible. Kircher called it Tuesday. Stay until the end to discover what bizarre nickname the crew gave their floating bow section. Commander Joe Kircher wasn't the type of officer who left anything to chance. As first lieutenant and damage control officer of USS Pittsburgh, he possessed an almost fanatical dedication to preparation. While other officers saw damage control drills as tedious requirements, Kircher viewed them as life or death rehearsals for catastrophes that would inevitably come. When Pittsburgh was commissioned on October 10, 1944, at the Four Rivers Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, Kircher immediately began the most intensive damage control training program anyone aboard had ever experienced. The ship was a Baltimore-class heavy cruiser, 674 feet 11 inches of fighting steel, displacing 13,600 tons fully loaded. She carried 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets and 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns. Under Captain Johnny Gingrich's command and Executive Officer Commander Horacio Rivero's supervision, Pittsburgh spent October through December 1944 training along the East Coast and Caribbean. But while other departments practiced gunnery and navigation, Kircher drove his damage control teams through scenario after exhausting scenario. Flooding forward compartments, fires in engineering spaces, loss of power, loss of steering, combinations of multiple failures. Kircher organized his 1,142 crew members into damage control parties, each with specific responsibilities. Party leaders memorized their sections' layouts, valve locations, and shoring equipment positions. They practiced in darkness, simulating combat conditions when lighting might fail. They practiced with simulated casualties, learning to work short-handed when crew members were wounded or lost. The chief engineer, whose name appears in no historical records, but whose work proved absolutely vital, coordinated with Kircher on engineering casualties. They ran drills where boilers lost pressure, pumps failed, and electrical systems went offline. The engineering department learned to maintain propulsion under conditions that would paralyze less prepared ships. Every valve, every pump, every backup system became intimately familiar to the men who would operate them under pressure. On January 13, 1945, Pittsburgh departed Boston for the Panama Canal and the Pacific Theater. The voyage provided additional training opportunities. Kircher continued drilling his teams, refining procedures, identifying weaknesses. By the time Pittsburgh arrived at Ulithi Atoll on February 13, 1945, the crew's damage control capability exceeded that of cruisers with years more service. They would need every bit of that skill. Pittsburgh's first combat operation came during the Iwo Jima campaign. As part of Task Group 58.2 built around aircraft carrier USS Lexington, Pittsburgh provided anti-aircraft defense while carrier planes struck Japanese positions. The crew experienced their first taste of combat as Japanese aircraft attempted to penetrate the task force's defensive screen. Pittsburgh's guns engaged enemy planes. The sharp crack of 5-inch guns and rattle of 40mm weapons filling the air. But the defining moment came on. March 19, 1945, Japanese aircraft penetrated the task force's defenses and struck the aircraft carrier USS Franklin with 2 bombs. The explosions ignited fueled and armed aircraft on Franklin's flight deck, turning the 30,000-ton carrier into a floating inferno. Over 800 men perished in the initial explosions and subsequent fires. Franklin was dead in the water, burning furiously. Captain Gingrich immediately ordered Pittsburgh alongside the stricken carrier. It was extraordinarily dangerous. Secondary explosions rocked Franklin continuously. Burning fuel and debris fell into the water. The carrier could explode catastrophically at any moment, destroying any ship nearby. But Franklin's crew desperately needed help, and Pittsburgh answered the call. Pittsburgh's crew rescued 34 Franklin survivors from the water, while Franklin's own damage control parties fought desperately to save their ship. Watching Franklin's catastrophic damage reinforced every lesson Kircher had drilled into his teams. Fires out of control, massive flooding, structural damage threatening the ship's integrity. This was what happened when disaster struck unprepared. As Franklin's crew slowly gained control, she needed assistance to escape the combat zone. Commander Rivero, Pittsburgh's executive officer, supervised a towing operation that tested seamanship limits. Pittsburgh rigged a towing cable to the massive carrier. Rivero personally positioned himself on Pittsburgh's fantail, 1 foot on the cable to feel tension changes, maintaining constant three-way telephone communication with Gingrich on the bridge and the chief engineer in the engine room. For 24 continuous hours, Pittsburgh towed Franklin away from enemy-controlled waters. The towing cable, though strong, was relatively small for a 30,000-ton carrier. Rivero monitored tension constantly, calling minute adjustments to the engine room. Too much power would snap the cable. Too little would allow Franklin to drift sideways and capsize. The chief engineer responded instantly to every order, modulating propeller speed with precision that would have been impossible without intensive training. By early June 1945, the Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey operated off Japan's coast, launching continuous carrier strikes against Japanese military targets. The tempo was exhausting. Pilots flew multiple missions daily. Support crews worked around the clock. Warships maintained constant vigilance against air attack. On June 4th, the fleet paused for replenishment, meeting with oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels at designated coordinates. Weather forecasters detected a tropical disturbance southeast of Okinawa. Initial reports suggested a small storm that could be avoided by minor course changes. Admiral Halsey ordered the fleet to alter course and increase speed. Throughout the day, the storm's track was monitored. But Pacific typhoons are notoriously unpredictable, and this one was both intensifying rapidly and moving faster than forecast models predicted. By evening on June 4th, conditions deteriorated dramatically. Winds increased from moderate to gale force within hours. Seas built from manageable swells to massive rolling mountains of water. Ships began rolling heavily despite their size. Pittsburgh's anemometer recorded wind speeds climbing past 50 knots, then 60, then 70. The instrument registered 125 knots before being ripped completely away by the screaming wind. Around midnight, Commander Rivero grew increasingly concerned. Pittsburgh was working heavily in the massive seas, rolling up to 45 degrees to each side. Green water cascaded over the bow with every pitch, submerging the forward deck under tons of ocean. Equipment could break loose despite being secured. Watertight doors might fail under repeated stress. The danger was real and immediate. Rivero found Captain Gingrich on the bridge, where the commanding officer had remained throughout the worsening conditions. Rivero made a suggestion that demonstrated the culture of preparedness Kircher had instilled throughout the ship. He recommended setting material condition zebra, the highest state of watertight integrity normally reserved for combat situations. Every watertight door would be closed, every hatch dogged down, every ventilation opening sealed. Gingrich didn't hesitate. The order went out immediately. Throughout Pittsburgh, damage control parties moved to execute Condition Zebra. Kircher personally supervised, ensuring every door was properly sealed, every closure checked. Men moving between compartments used proper procedures, closing doors behind them. The ship became a honeycomb of watertight compartments, each sealed from its neighbors. This decision, made hours before catastrophe struck, would save every single life aboard. Through the night of June 4th into the early morning hours of June 5th, Pittsburgh fought the Typhoon. Waves crashed over the bow with such force that the forward deck remained underwater more than it surfaced. The ship rolled so heavily that men held onto fixed objects, unable to walk without support. In the engineering spaces, boiler tenders and machinists maintained power despite violent motion that made simple tasks nearly impossible. Just before dawn, Pittsburgh's starboard floatplane was lifted from its catapult by wind alone. The aircraft weighed several tons and was secured with heavy chains and cables. The wind lifted it anyway, slamming it onto the deck where it disintegrated. Debris scattered across the midships area. Men stared at the wreckage in growing alarm. If wind could destroy a secured aircraft that easily, what else might fail? At 0630 hours on June 5, 1945, the catastrophe that Kircher had trained for arrived. Pittsburgh's bow rose on a massive wave, climbing what appeared to be a vertical wall of water 70 to 100 feet high. The bow reached its peak, higher than anyone aboard had ever seen. Then the ship plunged downward into the trough behind the wave, the bow knifing into the next approaching wave and disappearing completely under green water. Tremendous stress concentrated at frame 55, just forward of the number 1 8-inch turret, where the main deck joined the forecastle deck. The deck buckled upward. Steel screamed as welds failed progressively. The bow twisted upward at an unnatural angle. Then, with a sound like artillery fire heard throughout the ship, 104 feet of Pittsburgh's bow tore completely free. Commander Rivero and Captain Gingrich watched in horror from the bridge as a third of their ship became a separate floating object, rising and falling independently on the massive waves. The forward bulkhead, designed as an internal partition between compartments, now formed the ship's front. This bulkhead had never been intended to face the full fury of the Pacific Ocean. It was about to be tested beyond any design specification. Incredibly, miraculously, not one man was lost. Material condition Zebra had saved them all. Every watertight door had been closed hours earlier on Rivero's recommendation. No personnel were forward of the critical bulkhead when it failed. Everyone was at their damage control station, prepared for emergency. The foresight of the executive officer, the captain's immediate decision to act, and Kircher's months of intensive training had been vindicated in one terrible instant. But there was no time for relief or congratulation. Water poured into forward compartments through cracks in the bulkhead. The ship's forward movement, even at reduced speed, pushed thousands of gallons per minute through every imperfection in welds and plates. Pittsburgh's bow settled lower as water accumulated. If the bulkhead failed completely, the forward section would flood uncontrollably and the ship would sink within minutes. Commander Kircher was already moving. His damage control parties had trained for this exact scenario, though nobody truly believed they would face a situation where the entire bow simply disappeared. Kircher's team leaders knew their assignments without orders. They gathered shoring timbers, steel beams, mattresses, hammers, wedges, and damage control equipment. Within minutes, they were rushing forward into the flooding compartments, working in chest-deep water that sloshed violently with each roll of the ship. Kircher's teams executed procedures they had practiced dozens of times. Heavy wooden beams were wedged against the bulkhead at angles calculated to distribute stress. Steel shores were hammered into place, bracing against solid structure behind. Mattresses were stuffed into cracks where water jetted through with fire hose pressure. Canvas and wood plugs sealed smaller openings. Pumps were rigged immediately. Portable pumps were carried forward and positioned to remove water as fast as possible. Power cables were run from generator stations. The chief engineer ensured electrical power remained stable despite the ship's violent motion. Pump operators stood in the flooding water, holding their equipment steady, maintaining suction despite debris and motion, trying to clog intake screens. Kircher moved through the flooding compartments like a man possessed, checking shores, directing teams, identifying priorities. His uniform was soaked through. His hands bled from handling rough timbers and sharp metal. But his voice remained calm, and his orders were clear. The men responded with the discipline he had instilled through months of training. There was no panic, no confusion. Everyone knew their job and executed it professionally, despite circumstances that would paralyze untrained crews. The battle lasted hours. As fast as they sealed leaks, the bulkheads flexing opened new ones. Shores that held initially would slip as the ship rolled. Pumps would lose suction when debris clogged screens. But Kircher's teams adapted continuously. They reinforced shores that showed stress. They cleared pump screens. They stuffed additional mattresses into cracks that reopened. Slowly, gradually, they gained control. On the bridge, Captain Gingrich faced decisions that would determine whether Pittsburgh survived or joined the thousands of ships resting on the Pacific floor. The storm still raged. 70-knot winds howled. 100-foot waves still battered the crippled cruiser. But now, Pittsburgh faced an additional deadly threat. Her own detached bow floated nearby, a 1,000-ton battering ram driven by wind and current. If the separated bow struck Pittsburgh amidships, it could hold the hull and doom the ship, regardless of Kircher's efforts forward. Gingrich had to maneuver Pittsburgh to maintain safe separation, while not stressing the damaged bulkhead beyond its limits. The problem was extraordinarily complex. Pittsburgh's natural tendency was to turn bow first into the wind and waves, the safest position for normal operations. But the damaged bulkhead couldn't withstand direct wave impact. Turning away from the wind would present the bulkhead to following seas, but risked broaching, where the ship turned sideways to the waves and could capsize. Gingrich chose a middle course, literally. He would hold Pittsburgh quarter onto the seas through continuous small adjustments in engine power. It required constant attention and perfect coordination between bridge and engine room. The chief engineer received continuous instructions from the bridge through telephone circuits that Rivero supervised. Small adjustments in propeller speed kept Pittsburgh at the optimal angle. A few extra revolutions, and she would turn too far toward the wind. A few less, and she would fall off and broach. For 7 continuous hours, the bridge and engine room maintained this delicate balance, while Kircher's teams fought flooding forward. Commander Rivero coordinated everything. He maintained contact with Kircher in the forward compartments, Gingrich on the bridge, and the chief engineer in the engine spaces. Damage reports flowed through him. Resource requests came to him. He prioritized, allocated, and ensured everyone had what they needed. His experience towing Franklin proved invaluable. He understood stress on cables, on structures, on men pushed beyond normal endurance. Around 13:30 hours, the storm began subsiding. Wind speeds decreased gradually. Wave heights diminished from mountainous to merely dangerous. The immediate crisis hadn't ended, but the worst was past. Kircher's teams continued working, but the desperate pace slowed. They could now focus on improvement rather than bare survival. Shores were reinforced. Pumps were repositioned for better efficiency. Additional sealing materials were applied. With the storm subsiding and the bulkhead stabilized, Captain Gingrich faced the next challenge: getting Pittsburgh to port. The nearest major facility was Guam, approximately 900 nautical miles away. At normal cruising speed of 20 knots, the journey would take about 45 hours. But Pittsburgh couldn't make 20 knots. The damaged bulkhead couldn't withstand the water pressure of high-speed transit. Gingrich ordered 6 knots, about 7 miles per hour. At that speed, water pressure against the bulkhead remained manageable. Pumps could keep ahead of leakage. Shores wouldn't be stressed beyond their capacity. But 6 knots meant the journey to Guam would take over 6 days. 6 days of continuous pumping. 6 days of constant vigilance. 6 days where any new damage could prove catastrophic. Kircher established a watch rotation for the forward compartments. Teams worked 4 hours on, 4 hours off, continuously monitoring the shored bulkhead. They checked every shore for signs of stress or slippage. They watched for new leaks. They maintained pumps and cleared debris from intake screens. The work was exhausting and nerve-wracking, but nobody complained. They understood their survival depended on this vigilance. The chief engineer faced his own challenge, maintaining continuous pump operation for 6 days. Pumps require maintenance. Bearings need lubrication. Motors generate heat that must be cooled. Electrical systems must remain stable. The engineering department established its own rotation, ensuring pumps never stopped while allowing maintenance on backup units. They monitored power generation carefully, balancing load across generators. Pittsburgh began her slow journey to Guam on June 5th, crawling across the Pacific at 6 knots. Other ships in the task force had scattered during the storm. Many reported damage. The heavy cruiser Baltimore suffered structural damage. The light cruiser Duluth took serious hits. Destroyers reported various casualties. But Pittsburgh's damage was by far the most spectacular and potentially lethal. No ship loses 104 feet of its bow and survives. Until Pittsburgh did exactly that, Captain Gingrich remained on the bridge throughout the journey, catnapping in his chair, but never truly resting. He constantly monitored weather reports, course, speed, and status reports from throughout the ship. Commander Rivero supervised everything else: crew morale, food service, communications with other vessels, and coordination between damage control and engineering. He ensured Kircher's teams had everything they needed, and that the chief engineer's requests received priority. While Pittsburgh crawled toward Guam, attention also focused on her floating bow section. Naval tradition and practicality both dictated it should be salvaged if possible. The bow section, nicknamed McKeesport, after a suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, floated inverted approximately 100 nautical miles from Pittsburgh. It weighed roughly 1,000 tons and contained valuable equipment and materials. More importantly, it posed a navigation hazard to other vessels. At 1842 hours on June 5th, the fleet tug USS Munsey, designated ATF-107, received orders to salvage the bow. Accompanied by destroyer escort USS Stockham for protection, Munsey approached the drifting structure. The bow floated upside down, rising and falling on residual swells. Securing a towing cable to an inverted bow section of a heavy cruiser proved extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Munsey's crew worked through the night, eventually securing a tow line to structural members they could reach. They began the long tow toward Guam, making even slower progress than Pittsburgh. The inverted bow created tremendous drag, limiting Munsey to just a few knots. On June 8th, a second tug, USS Pecana, designated ATF-108, was ordered to assist. Together, the two tugs managed to maintain towing speed. The crew quickly developed humor about their situation. Official reports referred to the floating bow as a suburb of Pittsburgh. Some sailors joked that they commanded the longest ship in the world, with thousands of miles separating bow and stern, but both technically still USS Pittsburgh. The nickname McKeesport became official in crew communications and appeared in some Navy documents. A rare example of informal humor being adopted officially, June 10th, 1945. After 5 days of crawling across the Pacific, Pittsburgh's crew sighted Guam. The island's distinctive profile appeared on the horizon, growing slowly as the crippled cruiser approached at her steady 6 knots. On the docks at Apra Harbor, repair crews assembled. They had been notified of Pittsburgh's condition and prepared equipment, materials, and plans for emergency repairs. Pittsburgh entered Apra Harbor slowly and carefully. Without a proper bow, maneuvering required unusual techniques. Gingrich conned the ship personally, ordering minute engine adjustments. Tugs stood by to assist if needed. Finally, Pittsburgh tied up at her assigned berth. When the engines stopped and mooring lines were secured, a collective sigh of relief echoed through the ship. They had made it. Not one life lost. A ship that should have sunk had sailed 900 miles to safety. When Pittsburgh secured to the dock at Guam, the extent of damage became fully visible to those who hadn't experienced the typhoon firsthand. The forward bulkhead, designed as an internal partition, now formed the ship's front. Water stains and damage marked where flooding had occurred. The shoring installed by Kircher's teams remained in place, a testament to their desperate work saving the ship. Shortly after arrival, Munsey and Pakana towed McKeesport into harbour. The sight was surreal. 104 feet of heavy cruiser bow, inverted, being towed like a captured prize. Photographers documented the arrival. Images of the upside-down bow section became iconic representations of Typhoon Viper's power. Navy officials who hadn't believed the initial reports now had undeniable proof of what Pittsburgh had survived. Investigation into the bow failure revealed critical information. The break occurred due to inadequate welds at Bethlehem Shipbuilding Company's Fall River shipyard. During wartime construction, when yards pushed to deliver ships as quickly as possible, quality control had been insufficient. The welds connecting the main deck to the forecastle deck at frame 55 hadn't met required strength specifications. Under extreme stress, they failed catastrophically. This discovery triggered immediate inspections of other Baltimore-class cruisers built at the same yard. Several showed similar welding deficiencies and required emergency reinforcement. The Navy implemented much stronger welding inspection protocols to prevent future failures. Pittsburgh's bow loss, while dramatic, probably saved other ships from similar catastrophic failures in future storms. The investigation's findings improved construction standards across naval shipbuilding. For Commander Joe Kircher and his damage control teams, official recognition came through various channels. Kircher received the Legion of Merit for his actions during the typhoon and his exceptional preparation that made survival possible. The citation specifically mentioned his intensive training program that prepared the crew for catastrophic damage. Several team leaders received commendations for their actions during the crisis, but the greatest recognition came from their shipmates. Everyone aboard Pittsburgh understood that Kircher's obsessive training had saved their lives. The drills they had sometimes resented, the scenarios that seemed unrealistic, the endless practice in uncomfortable conditions, all of it had prepared them for the moment when 104 feet of their ship disappeared. Professional competence had defeated nature's fury. Engineers at Guam's Naval Operating Base immediately began work on a temporary bow nicknamed the stub bow. The design was simple, a flat-fronted plate structure extending about 30 feet forward of the damaged bulkhead, creating a more hydrodynamic shape than the flat bulkhead alone. Heavy internal bracing transferred stress from the temporary bow to solid structure. The design didn't restore Pittsburgh's original appearance, but allowed her to cross the Pacific safely at moderate speeds. Repair crews worked around the clock for 2 weeks. Welders fabricated plates that were lifted by cranes and positioned precisely. Internal bracing was installed and welded to Pittsburgh's main structure. Kircher supervised the work as it affected damage control systems and watertight integrity. He ensured the temporary bow integrated properly with existing compartmentation. Finally, on June 24th, the stub bow was complete, and Pittsburgh was declared ready for the trans-Pacific voyage. Pittsburgh departed Guam on June 24, 1945, bound for Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. The journey took over 3 weeks at reduced speed. Pittsburgh steamed independently rather than with a task force, her stub bow creating unusual wave patterns. She arrived at Puget Sound on July 16, 1945. There, construction began on a complete new bow, essentially rebuilding 1/3 of the ship. The work required months and hundreds of skilled workers. By the time repairs were completed in early 1946, World War II had ended. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945. Aboard battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Pittsburgh missed the final operations and victory celebration. Still under repair at Puget Sound, she was placed in reserve on March 12, 1946, and officially decommissioned on March 7, 1947, joining hundreds of other warships in the rapid post-war drawdown. When the Korean War broke out in June 1950, Pittsburgh was recommissioned on September 25, 1951. She served with the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean through the mid-1950s. Before being decommissioned again in 1956, she remained in reserve until 1973, when she was finally struck from the Naval Register. The rebuilt bow performed flawlessly through her post-war service, showing no signs of the catastrophic failure that nearly ended her career. Commander Joe Kircher's obsession with preparation became a case study taught at damage control schools throughout the Navy. His training methodology was analyzed and incorporated into damage control curricula. The lesson was clear: realistic, intensive training saves lives. Practicing for scenarios that seem unlikely prepares crews for the inevitable day when the unlikely becomes reality. Kircher's approach influenced damage control training for generations of sailors. Commander Horacio Rivero, who served as executive officer during the Typhoon, continued his distinguished naval career. He became the first Hispanic 4-star admiral in United States Navy history, serving as Vice Chief of Naval Operations before retiring in 1972. In oral history interviews, he recounted the Typhoon and Franklin towing operation as among the most challenging experiences of his long career. He consistently credited Kircher's damage control preparations as the critical factor in Pittsburgh's survival. Captain John E. Gingrich's leadership during the crisis marked him as an exceptional commanding officer. His decision to immediately implement material conditions Zebra on Rivero's recommendation, hours before the bow separated, demonstrated trust in his officers and willingness to take precautions that might seem excessive. That decision saved 1,142 lives. His ship handling during the storm and subsequent voyage showed seamanship of the highest order. The chief engineer, whose name remains frustratingly absent from historical records despite his crucial role, demonstrated mastery of his department, maintaining power through the Typhoon, executing minute engine adjustments during 7 hours of storm positioning, keeping pumps running continuously for 6 days, and ensuring electrical systems remained stable throughout. All required exceptional professional competence and leadership. Today, USS Pittsburgh's story is preserved in naval museums, historical societies, and veteran organizations. Models typically show her in original configuration rather than damaged or with stub bow, but photographs and documents preserve the complete story. The USS Pittsburgh Association, formed by veterans who served aboard during various commissions, held reunions for decades, sharing stories and preserving memories. The lessons Pittsburgh taught remain relevant for every generation of sailors. Preparation matters, training matters, leadership matters. When Captain Gingrich trusted Rivero's judgment and set material conditions Zebra hours before the crisis, he demonstrated that good officers listen to experienced subordinates. When Kircher drove his teams through endless drills that seemed excessive, he proved that realistic training saves lives. When the Chief Engineer's Department maintained pumps for 6 continuous days, they showed that professional competence overcomes impossible circumstances. The story also demonstrates the value of damage control as a core naval skill. Every sailor, regardless of rate or specialty, must understand damage control fundamentals. In crisis, the ship becomes everyone's responsibility. Pittsburgh survived because 1,142 crew members, from commanding officer to the most junior seaman, worked together with discipline and determination. When old sailors gather and tell tales of remarkable ships and incredible voyages, USS Pittsburgh's story stands among the most extraordinary. The heavy cruiser that lost her bow yet sailed 900 miles to safety. Commander Joe Kircher's obsessive preparation that saved 1,142 lives. The floating bow nicknamed McKeesport that became its own legend. And the reminder that proper training, decisive leadership, and determined crews can overcome even nature's fury. The next time you see sailors practicing damage control drills, Remember Pittsburgh. Those seemingly tedious exercises might someday save their lives. When you hear about military training that seems excessive or unrealistic, remember Kircher. His excessive training defeated a typhoon. And when you wonder whether preparation really matters, remember 1,142 men who sailed home because their officers prepared them for catastrophe before it struck. Commander Joe Kircher didn't have a crystal ball. He couldn't predict that Typhoon Viper would tear off Pittsburgh's bow on June 5, 1945, but he prepared his crew for catastrophes that might never come. And when the unthinkable happened, that preparation made the difference between tragedy and triumph. That's the legacy of the damage control officer who saved a ship with no bow.